Shalom u'bracha. The first thing is a mazel tov to all of those b'nei aliyah who are about to be Messiahim Masechta Shabbos, long, difficult Masechta, and embark on the journey of Masechta Erevin. A special mazel tov because the siyum, a big part of this Masechta was learned under the adverse circumstances of the Corona, whether it meant disruption in the normal Charusashafts, and the normal Shiurim, the normal venue and comfort zone where these Shiurim and Charusashafts used to take place and are going to continue to take place. So it's a measure of Torah shalamadati bi'af, and Chazal teach us, Af Chachmasi Amdali, that the Chachma, the Torah that a person learns in adversity and under adverse conditions, that's the Chachma, that's Amdalai, that stands to his defense in his Melchemes HaYetzer, and is a Malamed Tzchus on him. So there's a special siyum. It's a siyum of a Masechta learned under adverse circumstances. So I give you my bracha, Kashem Shezachiseim, L'sayim Masechta Zu, Kein Tisku Lahaschil, or L'sayim Kol HaMasechta Shebashas. A special Yeshikoyach to the Me'arganim, to Agudas Yisrael, Daf Yomi Commission, and those that stand behind these shiurim and these limudim, standing as a friendly reminder, as a big brother, to be mechazik us and to be ma'orer us, to go mechoyel al choyel b'limud HaTorah, and to keep on reinforcing the conviction that Eloi at LaKadosh Baruch Hu b'yolamai ela daled amis shel halacha bilvad, especially in these times of that we commemorate Churban Beis Hamikdash, as miyom shecharav Beis Hamikdash, ein lo lakadosh baruch hu b'olamai ela dalet amis shel halacha bilvad, and be having a kviyus to go through the whole entire Shas Masechta after Masechta b'kviyus without hefsek. That's giving HaKadosh Baruch Hu his dalet amis shel halacha, and giving the Shechina a makam v'shachanti b'soicham b'sachat kol echad v'yechad, and b'schus zeh, and b'chus HaTorah v'ein shiur elo HaTorah hazois, we should be going from chayil al chayil, and to be zoiche, that this should all serve as a catalyst to the geula shleima b'meher b'yameinu amen.
First of all, mazel tov to the Messiahim on Masechta Shabbos, a wonderful accomplishment. Good Yom Tov to you all. Chazal tell us a siyum is like a Yom Tov for finishing a beautiful Masechta. And I want to thank Agudas Yisrael for giving me the opportunity of partaking in this momentous occasion. And I was thinking how to make it truly a Yom Tov, Ein Toiv Ela Torah, Chazal tell us. So maybe we'll discuss the contemporary issues regarding Bishul, I guess new shaylas, contemporary questions, and we'll find all of the answers in the ancient, timeless messages that we learned throughout the Masechta. We'll make sort of a hadran, we'll connect the beginning of the Masechta, the middle of the Masechta, the end of the Masechta, and find the yesodis that we need to apply it to the myriad of questions that we are faced with as we confront Hilchos Shabbos on a very practical level. For example, someone asked me, he wanted to make instant soup on Shabbos. Instant soup, you add some hot water to lakshin, dried lakshin, and there's spices, and there's vegetables. Is that mutter on Shabbos? He forgot to make tea scents on Shabbos. Could he make tea with a tea bag that was never cooked? Well, listen to this question. Someone prepared eggs to make eggs on Shabbos, and he cracked the first of many eggs, and he realized that the eggs were not cooked fully, and now he has soft boiled eggs. Now, serving soft-boiled eggs in a camp is a good idea, but you can't make egg salad from soft-boiled eggs. Is it mutter to put those eggs into hot water and transform them from soft to hard? Or a woman prepared soup, she's having guests, and she forgot to spice the soup properly. Is there any way to spice the soup before you serve it to the guests? It's pretty embarrassing to serve soup and say, oh, please add your own spices. That's not what she wants to do. And this and many other questions we're going to find the answers, the guidance in our Masechta Shabbos that we learned. And sit back or sit up and enjoy. The Mishnah says in Masechta Shabbos, Daf Mem Beis, Ho'ilfus v'kadeira shehaviru musachin layitin l'soichei tavlin. Basically, when you have a pot of soup, ilfus and kadeira are different types of pots, but basically you have a pot of soup, you're not allowed to add spices to that hot pot of soup. Oh, wonderful, custom made for our question. You're not allowed to add spices to that pot of soup, even though you took it off the fire. Now we wonder, because if the pot is not on the fire, how is it able to cook? So now we have a problem. The soup is unspiced. How do we add spices? So let's continue in the Mishnah. Says the Mishnah, but all is not lost. It says the Mishnah very simply. Take the pot, we'll have some visual aid. You can't add spices to that pot. Transfer from the pot into a serving bowl, and then you could add the spices to that serving bowl. So then, after it is properly spiced, you could serve the serving bowl, and everyone will be happy. The housewife is confident that the soup is tasty enough for the guests. But the question is obvious. If indeed the soup is so hot that it's able to cook when it's in the pot, so why is it better when it's in a serving bowl? So Rashi says, Klisheni einim mavashal. This is the famous concept of Klisheni that Chazal understood, that because there was a transfer from the pot into the serving bowl, this Klisheni is incapable of cooking. So now you could add the uncooked spices, and there's no concern of Bishul. So here we see Kli Rishon is capable of cooking even off the fire. Kli Sheni, and again I'm using this bowl, this is all I have, but imagine this would be a serving bowl. Kli Sheni of any sort is incapable of cooking. And you're allowed to add spices. If you remember the Gemara in Shabbos, Daf Mem Amud Beis, the Gemara says you're allowed to add oil to a Kli Sheni, because again, a Kli Sheni is incapable of cooking oil. A third source is a Gemara and a Mishnah in Shabbos Mem Beis. Water cannot be cooked in a Kli Sheni. Now this has an important halachic ramification. Let's say the soup was properly spiced, but extra guests showed up Friday evening, and the housewife was not prepared for these guests. So since I was a child, I heard when you have extra guests, don't problem, just add a little bit of water. Now, needless to say, to add cold water to a hot pot of soup is Bishul Deraisa. So all you have to do is take that hot pot of soup, put it into a serving bowl, which is a Kli Sheni, and then you could add, believe it or not, even cold water into that serving bowl, because Kli Sheni is incapable of cooking water. So here we have three halachas in Masechta Shabbos. Kli Sheni can't cook spices, it can't cook water, it can't cook oil. And the fourth example, actually it's a Gemara also, is ox meat, very tough meat, cannot be cooked in a Kli Sheni. So this is the concept of Kli Sheni, which, as we'll see, has many ramifications in halacha. But before you apply this to the contemporary issues, there's one more concept that we have to clarify. Because the Mishnah, towards the end of Masechta Shabbos, Daf Kuf Mem Hey, reminds us there's a concept called Kalei HaBishul. To make a long story short, the Mishnah discusses a Meliach HaYoshen, V'kulias HaSpanyan. Those are different types of fish. Now, conventionally, it's touched as a mackerel or a carp, but basically, fish, because of its soft, tender, cooks easily. With minimal cooking, fish is prepared from raw to cooked. And that's called kali abishal. The fact that it's able to be cooked in a low temperature for a short amount of time worried Chazal that could be cooked even in a kli sheni. And the truth is we see this today. People have started to eat raw fish, sushi. Obviously, fish doesn't need much to prepare it. But the Mishnah is telling us that something that's kali abishal, which means it cooks easily, could even be cooked in a kli sheni. And the Mishnah uses a lashon, that's the gemar malocha. That's its final process. That's the makabah patish of preparing a kali abishal. You don't have to put it in a hot, steaming kli rishon, even in a kli sheni, or better yet, as the Mishnah says, pouring hot water from a kli sheni. In other words, you took water from the urn, put it into a cup, and now the cup is a kli sheni, and you pour that onto this kali abishal, these type of fish, even that's able to cook. This is already irui kli sheni, which is similar to kli shlishi. But the key word here is kali abishal. That's the gemar malocha. And you could even cook it in a irui kli sheni. The question is, what about everything else? We saw water, oil, spices, tough meat, doesn't get cooked in a kli sheni, period. Kali abishal, i.e. fish, could get cooked even in a irui kli sheni. What about everything in between? There are many, many foods in between. So logic dictates, if something is suspect to be a kali abishal, we have to treat it like a safek deraisa. Because don't forget, kali abishal, that's gemar malacha, that's makabah patish, that's preparing it. So something that you're not sure what it is would be at least a safek bishal deraisa. And that is the shita of the Arayim, one of the great Rishonim, one of the Bali Atoises, Rabbi Lezami Mitz in Amid Kufla Medalid, where he says that anything that we don't know is certainly kali abishal, that there's certainly not chomri abishal, is suspect to be kali abishal. And therefore, any foods that we are not sure what they are, we have to treat them like kali abishal. And the Poskim quote this Uraim as normative halacha. So we have the following, let's review, that a kli rishon, even off the fire, is able to cook. That's the Mishnah. Once you put it into a different utensil, a kli sheni, a serving bowl or a cup, kli sheni is incapable of cooking anything that is chomrei habishal. What did we see is certainly chomrei habishal, does not get cooked easily. So we saw the examples of water, oil, spices, and tough meat. Other things that are kali abishal, and we saw the Mishnah about fish. The Chazon Ish says, proving it from a Gemara in the beginning of Masechta Shabbos, that eggs are also kali habishal. Eggs also cook easily. And the truth is, we realize that. You don't need much to cook an egg. So an egg is kali habishal, and according to Yereim, basically anything that we're not certain is chomri habishal should be considered kali habishal, and we should not put it even into a kli sheni, because kali habishal is cooked even in a kli sheni, even in irui kli sheni. Now to apply this lamaisa, I hope it should be a sheer delight or a delightful sheer, but you'll see once we have the basic yesides, everything else really flows naturally. Question: you had unexpected guests, and there's not enough soup. But the good news is that you prepared a very heavy soup, and you could add some water, and it will still have that tasty chicken soup flavor. Is it possible, and how is it possible to add cold water that was never cooked to the pot, to the soup, and then you expand the volume of the soup that you have enough to serve the guests. So obviously to add cold water to a hot pot of soup is malach of Bishul. That's the Mishnah. The Kli Rishon is capable of cooking even off the fire. But the good news is, all you have to do is take the pot of soup, put it into a serving bowl, and then you could add as much as cold water as you desire. The cold water will merge with the soup and become hot soup. That doesn't make a difference. Because as we just explained, water does not get cooked in a Kli Sheni, period. Chazal guaranteed us water is never cooked in a Kli Sheni. So all you have to do is take the soup from the Kli Rishon, put it into a serving bowl, add the amount of water that you would need, and then you expanded your soup. That's perfectly legitimate based on the Masechta Shabbos that we just learned. Incidentally, I should mention, sometimes you get a bowl of soup and it's too hot. You want to add cold water. The same halacha applies because the soup in your bowl is a Kli Sheni at least. So adding cold water is perfectly legitimate. Our children sometimes want to put in an ice cube into the hot soup. Why not put in cold water? Well, the way they say it, it's sticky. It's just more fun to put in an ice cube into hot soup. Believe it or not, that's also perfectly mutter. Because since the soup is in a Kli Sheni, and at worst, ice cubes is water, water is never cooked in a Kli Sheni. Now you might remember from Masechta Shabbos, but what about noilad? I'm changing the texture of the ice cube from frozen to liquid. Why is that a question of moilid or noilid? The answer is that that's only when you see a new identity that was created. When you crush water, that's the Gemara Masechta Shabbos, where you crush ice to make water, that is moilid. You're changing ice to water. But here, the ice cube merges with the soup. There's nothing discernible, and there's no concern of moilid in this case. Another question, you are given a job to dry the serving bowl because I want to use it, but it's wet, it was just rinsed. Can I take the hot pot of soup and pour it directly into the serving bowl? So that's a problem. Because you think about it, the cold water residue in the serving bowl was never cooked. Water from the sink. By pouring from the hot pot directly on into the serving bowl, you're hitting the cold water residue in the serving bowl, and that's Bishul. So one eitzah would be to dry the serving bowl. But there's another eitzah. If you want to save the time of drying it, and that is take the soup from the pot, put it into any clean utensil, and then you could pour it onto the moist serving bowl. Because now the content of the soup, the soup itself, is very Kli Sheni. So the soup coming from that different bowl into your serving bowl will never cook the water because this is beyond Kli Sheni. You're given a job to dry properly the baby bottle. Now, if you ever did that before, that's a very difficult task. You have to somehow get in a towel into the baby bottle and dry it well. Because your wife wants to pour hot water from the urn straight into the baby bottle. And she's right, you can't pour it from the urn straight into the baby bottle because there's water that was never cooked. You just rinse the bottle. There's water that was never cooked. So it will take you a nice few minutes to dry the baby bottle properly. And don't forget, the water coming from the urn that's hitting this cold water in the baby bottle is real bishul because that was never cooked. But there's a simple eitzah. I call it the lazy man's eitzah. Take any clean cup, hot cup or mug, whatever it is that's dry, pour the water from the urn into that mug, okay? And then you could pour it straight into the baby bottle. There's cold water in the baby bottle that was never cooked. But now, don't forget, the hot water is coming from a Kli Sheni. Kli Sheni can't cook water. So instead of drying the serving bowl or drying the baby bottle, etc., there's a simple eitzah to put the water into any clean cup and from there pour it into the baby bottle without any shaila whatsoever. We've often said this, and especially in Chashabis, you'll notice the more you learn, you could be guided properly, because halacha allows this without question. Someone prepared tea scents before Shabbos. That's the good news. But the bad news, they forgot to leave it on the blech, and now they have cold tea scents on Shabbos. How can you use tea scents that's cold? So the answer is very simple. To pour water from the urn straight onto the tea scents might be a problem. Because although the tea scents was cooked, but it cooled off. And as we know, yesh bishul acha bishul, by a davalach, by a liquid that cooled, but hope is not lost. All you do is take water, take it from a urn, pour it into a clean cup, and then you could pour that onto the tea scents in a different cup. Because again, this is using the principle that we just learned. The water is now in a klisheni. Klisheni that's being poured directly onto cold tea scents will never ever cook that tea scents. Because the tea scents is essentially water, and water is not cooked in a klisheni. The tea essence was cooked and is still cooked because it's that itself will treat as a non-liquid. So when you look at the tea scents, it's intimidating, but it's really not. Once you change its status from a kli rishon to a kli sheni, water is never cooked. Now people, when they make a tea on Shabbos, a coffee on Shabbos, especially in a shul, I sometimes find it amusing. You have people using 1 cup, 2 cups, 3 cups, and before long there's a whole array of cups that people use, and because people think the kalamarba, the more cups you use, I raise them a shubach. Now let's learn once and for all how to make a cup of coffee on Shabbos, and you'll see you don't need more than 1 extra cup, even for 1,000 people. I know that sounds daunting, but it's not. The truth is, it really should be mutal to take a clean hot cup, put some instant coffee in, and pour straight from the urn right onto the instant coffee. Because as you probably do know, instant coffee is always cooked. Actually, they take the roasted, ground coffee beans and they cook it, they brew it, and then they remove the water either with the 2 different methods, either spray drying or freeze drying, that's the material. So coffee, instant coffee, is generally cooked. So ein bishul acha bishul. Why can I pour water from the urn straight onto the instant coffee? True, it's coming from a kli rishon, but big deal. Ein bishul acha bishul, the coffee is cooked. And the truth is, there are those that are mekel, because coffee is a solid, ein bishul acha bishul. However, the Paiskim mentioned the fact that coffee is a soluble. The coffee, when it comes in contact with hot water, it dissolves. So maybe it has the status of a liquid, because eventually it liquefies. Since coffee is a soluble, it's used in its liquid form. So although right now the coffee is a solid, it's a powder, but its use is as a liquid, and maybe we have to treat coffee powder as a liquid. And that's why the Welt is machmir. We don't pour hot water straight onto instant coffee. If someone does it, it's not the end of the world, because he could go with the shittas that instant coffee is considered a solid, but we are choishes for that shita. Rabbi says to be choishes for that shita, so we never pour hot water directly onto coffee powder. So what's the eitzah? It's the same thing we learned till now. Take a clean cup and take this cup and fill it with hot water. Then you take a second cup that has the instant coffee in it and pour it from cup number 1 directly into your coffee cup. And then enjoy, make a bracha and enjoy. Because here, there's no concern. Because this is already a kli shlishi. The urn is a kli rishon, this first cup is a kli sheni, and this cup is a kli shlishi. So to make coffee in a simple way is you just need one extra cup, and that's it. But here's my point. Someone else comes. You're in a shul, you're in a yeshiva. Everybody has to have 2 cups. Before long, you have tens of cups lying around, wasted. And that's foolish. That I could say we're not using our cup. Because all you need for 1,000 people is 1 extra cup. And let me explain. I come to make coffee first. I pour hot water into this cup, and I pour the water into my coffee cup with coffee, and I drink. I put this cup down that was never used. I mean, it has some water droplets, but I didn't drink from it. I put it down. The next fellow comes, takes this cup, which is still moist, I agree, and maybe the water cooled off, puts his coffee into that. Okay? Then he takes 1 clean cup, puts water into it, pours it onto this cup, and drinks his coffee gesundheit. He puts down his moist cup, which is this one. The next fellow takes that cup, puts his coffee into it, takes a clean cup, pours it onto that. This used cup he'll put down, and the next fellow uses it for his coffee. Now, I know people don't like to use anybody else's cup, especially in this COVID-19 situation, but no one drank from this. This is just a transferring cup. So it has a little moisture. You'll say, wait a minute, but why isn't there Bishul when my hot water goes into this cup and cooks the droplets? The answer is that Mayim cannot get cooked in a kli sheni. And this is already a kli shlishi or iri kli sheni. So all you need for a multitude of people is 1 extra hot cup. All you have to do is use your cup, apply the learning that you did so diligently, and you'll see, even for 1,000 people, 1 extra cup is sufficient. Now this is, as far as making a coffee, adding sugar is basically the same idea. Sugar comes from cooked sugar canes, so the extract, which we call sugar, was already cooked, and therefore, technically, you should be able to pour hot water directly onto sugar. However, we have the same issue. Sugar is also a soluble, like instant coffee. It turns into liquid, and the places that we should treat sugar like a liquid. So to pour hot water directly onto sugar should be avoided. But you have the same eitzah. Take a clean cup, fill it with hot water, put the coffee and now the sugar into the second cup, and pour the water directly onto that, and you have a wonderful cup of coffee. You put the cup down, and someone else uses that cup, puts his coffee, his sugar, and takes a new cup, pours it onto that, and you continue 1,000 people enjoying coffee with only 1 extra cup. Now, I'm not worried about the extra cups that people use, but it's something that we could do better if we apply the learning. Yagia kapecha ki soichal. I heard it on Masechta Shabbos, I'm going to apply Masechta Shabbos, and then you'll see Ashrecha v'toivlach. Ashrecha b'olam hazeh. You're doing just as good as anybody else. But you're saving cups, you're saving tircha. Ashrecha b'olam hazeh v'toivlach b'olam haba. Now, the same is true regarding cocoa. However, there are some cocos that were never cooked. You have to be more wary of that. But basically, sugar and coffee with 1 extra cup, that's basically all you need. The Shmir Shabbos cautions, and he wrote this many years ago, and today it's certainly even more true, a person has to be updated with the current information. They're marketing a coffee today that a part of it was never cooked, to add a certain flavor to it. That type of coffee, all agree you can't pour hot water directly onto that. Even if you consider coffee powder as a solid and you're not worried about it having the status of a liquid, but if some of the coffee was never cooked, and again, they're marketing this type of coffee now that has part of it that was never cooked, you can't pour hot water directly onto that instant coffee. if someone wants to make coffee for his elderly parent or grandparent, so the truth is sometimes people use an extra cup, and by the time the elderly person gets the cup of tea, it's cold. There's no reason to do that. You don't need more than one extra cup. Some people pour into this cup and back and forth. I don't know why, but you want to do that for yourself, it's fine. But if your parent asks for a nice hot cup of coffee, don't be machmir, give them a cup of coffee the way as hot as it can be. They could enjoy it. And ashrecha b'olam hazeh v'toiv lo b'olam haba. The next group of questions is regarding adding spices to hot soup, hot food for that matter. And our original example is a good mashal. The housewife forgot to season the soup properly, and she wants to add some pepper, garlic powder, whatever it may be, into this hot soup that's not properly spiced. So the first thing to know in every shaila is clarify the facts. Ground pepper was never cooked. It's ground. Onion and garlic powder was dehydrated, and then it was ground. Dehydration does not have the halachic status of cooking. Pepper was never cooked. So to add uncooked spices, garlic, onion powder, pepper, is a no-no, because cooking this otherwise uncooked spices. But what should be simple is to take the soup from the soup pot, pour it into a serving bowl, and then add the spices. Why? Because in the serving bowl, which is a kli sheni, we learned the Mishnah. Spices cannot be cooked in a kli sheni. So if it's good for the Mishnah, it's certainly good for us. So to add uncooked spices to a kli sheni should be mutter midin ha-Mishnah. And indeed, that is the opinion of many poskim. To properly spice a soup, don't spice it when it's in the original pot, put it into a serving bowl, and do whatever is necessary without any shaila whatsoever. Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach is quoted in the Shmir HaShabbos that had a reservation. And he said, it's true, if you take peppercorns, whole pepper, and add it to a kli sheni, that will never get cooked in a kli sheni. But today, typically, we use ground pepper. It has been made into a powder, it's very fine, and therefore, it's more susceptible to being cooked. Maybe ground pepper, as opposed to peppercorns, could even be cooked in a kli sheni, because in this situation, when they're ground, it should be considered kalei bishul. And therefore, you can add ground pepper or any other spices into a kli sheni. It changes status from chomrei bishul, like the Mishnah implies, to kalei bishul. Now, many poskim have questioned this. That means Rabbi Shlomo Zalman is assuming that in the Mishnah that permits spices was only when the spice was in its whole form. Did they use peppercorns? Today a person eats a peppercorn, he'll probably hit the ceiling. It's very strong. And they definitely ground spices. You learn Masechta Beya, Toichen, on Yom Tov, grinding spices. It was done. So why should we assume that the Mishnah that permits adding spices was only when it was in its whole form? And had that been so, someone should have said something should be indicated that this is only when it's ground. So I know many poskim accept Rabbi Shlomo Zalman's psak, and they would not allow adding ground spices to a kli sheni. But I did speak to many poskim who felt that this is an unreasonable chumrah. So we could say, if someone wants to be machmir, it's not so hard to be machmir. Instead of putting the soup into a serving bowl, put it first into any other keli, and then put it into the serving bowl, and then you could add the spices, because now its location is a kli shlishi. If for whatever reason that's difficult, and the housewife is embarrassed to serve the soup as it is, So certainly you could be saimach on the shita of most paiskim, that once the soup is in a serving bowl, it's a klisheni, and you could add even ground spices. I guess it's to be machmir in kvaid ishtai is also something. So again, if you could avoid the confrontation, it's better in a klishlishi, but miyikid din, it seems many paiskim feel nothing has changed, spice can be added to a klisheni, even ground spices. Adding salt is an interesting question, because salt actually is not a spice, it's a chemical. But besides that, the Gemara discusses salt. Salt has a very unknown property to it. Some say salt never gets cooked. Because of its nature, it never gets cooked. Other poskim say just the opposite. Salt is a classic kalei bishul. It gets cooked even a klisheni. The Shulchan Aruch, the Ramah actually says we should be some aser putting salt into a klisheni, which means the serving bowl. And the Ramah adds, hamachmir tovai olav bracha. If you're machmir not to add salt to a klisheni, the Ramah gives you a bracha. Now you notice, the Ramah is not saying it's asa in a klisheni. Had it been asa, he wouldn't have to give you a bracha. It seems the Ramah assumed that it's really mutter. It's a yesh oisrim, but it's really mutter. But the Ramah recommended being stringent, and he gave you a bracha for your efforts. And indeed, the minig Yisrael is not to add salt to a klisheni. I can't say it's asa, but the Ramah does say hamachma tavala bracha. The Mukhi Archaim, the Munkach Rebbe, in a Sefer on our Ramah writes that his father used to say, yeah, right, really you could add salt to klisheni mikid din. But is it worth giving up a bracha from the Ramah for a little bit salt? I guess we could dramatize it somewhat. Imagine you hear good news, the Ramah's coming to town. He's giving brachas. Who wouldn't run to get a bracha from the Ramah? Well, here the Ramah's offering a bracha. By not putting salt in a klisheni, you get the Ramah's bracha. So therefore, salt in a certain sense might be worse than spices. But it is yashayisra. But again, all is not lost. Once you add the soup to a kli shlishi, then you could add the salt, because certainly it's not cooked in a kli shlishi. But there is another factor that we have to be aware of. That basically, the Mishnah Berurah already writes this in his times, and today it's a little more complicated, but it's pretty much the same. There are two ways of producing salt. Either you take sea salt and you cook the water out, you cause the water to be evaporated from the mixture, and then you're left with salt. Or they mine salt, and then they grind the salt. First they find it in the mountains, wherever it is, the deposits of salt, and then they prepare it for sale. There's obviously a fundamental difference between the two cases. Because salt that is mined was never cooked. And that's the problem of typical salt that was never cooked. But sea salt that was cooked, ain't bishul acha bishul. So what's the problem? True, it's in a klisheni, but ain't bishul acha bishul. But then again, salt also is a soluble that liquefies. So here we have that same issue like we had with sugar. But don't forget, mi'ikad din, salt, the Ramah seem to say it never gets cooked. So you could be chayshish and put it in a kli shlishi, but there's enough poskim that allow adding salt to a klisheni. First of all, even uncooked salt cannot be cooked in a klisheni, and certainly cooked salt, there's what to be makel. However, and here is the problem, today many of the salts are not cooked. It's actually, the water is sort of, I would say baked, is the wrong word, but basically at a temperature, it's heated at a temperature of 200 degrees, that doesn't really qualify to be bishul. So it's more like afiyah. So then by adding salt to a hot soup, maybe it's bishul achar afiyah. Because the salt was prepared through a afiyah process. The absence of heat, it was just a heating process at a temperature of 200 degrees that evaporated the water, but it was never cooked. But Rabbi Zichron Livracha felt that the Ramos Chumrah was by uncooked salt. But once it was baked, we have that to be saimach, and it would be mutter, and it would not disqualify someone from the Ramos bracha. The Ramos bracha was talking about uncooked salt. And then there's another cheshbon. If indeed the salt was brought up to a temperature of 200 degrees, because it's easy to get prepared with that amount of heat, logic dictates when you put it into your hot soup, it won't cook any more. Because once 200 degrees was able to prepare the salt, nothing beyond that will do anything different. So you don't have to worry about any subsequent bishul, because the original preparation gave it the full identity of a salt that's cooked. But be that as it may, the poskim say to add salt, uncooked salt to a kli rishon should definitely not be done, but salt to a kli sheni, make it in his mutter, hamach metavala bracha, to add it to a kli shlishi. Basically, the salt today comes from different sources. Salt that's produced in warmer countries, they would often use the solar evaporation process. Salt that comes from other countries, it's cooked, it's hard to know. I spoke to someone that deals with these things. It's hard to know where the origin of the salt is, but basically, in a kli shlishi, you're certainly safe, and probably even a kli sheni, you're also okay. A fascinating point that just shows you how a person has to be updated with the actual reality. A number of years ago, the Rabbanim in Lakewood gave out the following kol koira. It seems that people buy ready-made food for Shabbos, a ready-made chicken dish, or there's many different dishes that are available, and they want to have it warm on Shabbos. Now the halacha is, when something is fully cooked and there's no liquid in it, you're allowed to warm it on Shabbos. That we learned in Masechta Shabbos. You can't put it directly onto the fire, but you could put it on top of a pot, on top of a cholent pot, and even though the chicken, the pre-cooked chicken, gets fully cooked, no problem. Ein bishul acha bishul. It's all solid food. That's the Mishnah. It's from cold to hot. That's not bishul. That's warming, and that's fine. You can't put it directly onto the blech, but you can put it on top of a cholent pot and enjoy gesundheit. So typically, many people bought these takeout foods in different forms, whether it's rice or chow mein or chicken. Again, there are many different varieties, and they would typically put it on top of the cholent pot Friday evening or Shabbos morning, whatever it was, and the food would warm and it would be piping hot. The problem is, and I saw pictures, and it's amazing, that takeouts, for whatever reasons they have, but lamaisa, they add uncooked spices after the dish was prepared. Typically, they would add uncooked pepper, parsley, sesame seeds, sometimes all of them, and that presents a problem. Because when you take this ready-made dish and put it on top of the cholent pot, and in a few minutes it will be piping hot, you're right, there's no bishul on the actual food, on the chicken or the rice, because they ain't bishul acha bishul by a solid food. But the uncooked spices was never cooked. And now it's getting cooked. It's getting cooked just like the rest of the food. You'll say, wait, but we learned the Mishnah that spices is not kalya bishul. Oh, but that's only when it's not on the fire. That's only in a kli sheni, like we learned. This is kli rishon al gabi ha'esh. Think about it. You're putting this ready-made dish in a wooden pan on top of the cholent pot, and it's being heated by the original source of fire, albeit through the cholent pot, but the spices in this dish were never cooked. They're being cooked in al gabi ha'esh by a fire. That is no heter. That's not what the Mishnah meant. So the Rabbanim in Lakewood gave out this kol koira, that either buy something without spices or realize that, and you can't rewarm this or warm this on Shabbos. But it's beautiful how a simple knowledge of the Metzias goes a long way. I'll give you another example. Someone asked me, he wants to add arbus. Today, it's a fad. You add arbus, chickpeas, to a hot soup. Any problem? So he had it figured out pretty much, because arbus are pre-cooked, and they're also solid food. So, ein bishul acha bishul. I could definitely add it to my bowl of soup. To put it onto the fire is a problem, but into a hot bowl of soup, klisheni, what's the problem? He's right. But one thing I did tell him, that typically these are spiced with ground pepper. After they're made, after the arbus are cooked, they add pepper. And according to Shlomo Zalman, that should not be done. Because Shlomo Zalman considered the pepper, the ground pepper, to be kalei bishul. And if you're adding it into the klisheni, a hot soup is capable of cooking that pepper. And indeed, in Shlomo Zalman's Sefer Shulchan Shleima, he is quoted as saying just that. But according to those cheetahs that are makel with any ground pepper, this would be mutter even as far as the pepper is concerned. Someone asked a question, he wanted to add a slice of lemon to a hot tea, a very hot tea. So he thought that maybe a slice of lemon should be considered a spice, tavlin. Now that's wrong, because lemon is not a spice, lemon is a fruit. And a fruit that was never cooked. So adding a slice of lemon to a hot cup of tea is tantamount to bishul. Because again, the lemon was never cooked, and certainly it's not within the heta of spices, tavlin, that the Mishnah permits. Another question is adding croutons or any baked item to a hot bowl of soup. So the truth is that we have a reason to assume that anything is kalei bishul, and perhaps croutons, soup mandlin, matzah, and the like should be considered kalei bishul. But let's not forget that typically the soup bowl that we have in front of us that we eat from is almost always a kli shlishi. First of all, if the soup was poured from the pot into a serving bowl and then to my bowl, that's clearly a kli shlishi. But as Mishnah Berurah says, even if you took straight from the pot into your bowl, most people don't pour from the pot right into the bowl. They use the medium of a ladle. The ladle is the klisheni, and then when the soup enters your bowl, it's a kli shlishi. And then we could rely on that to add croutons, mandlin, etc., etc. But you're probably wondering, why do we have to come on to that? Mandlin, matzah, and the like were already baked. So if they're already baked, ein bishul acha bishul. The answer we certainly know is ein bishul acha bishul is true. Arbus that were cooked, you're allowed to add to soup. But the mandlin and the croutons were baked. And we are choished for the shita, yesh bishul achar afiyah. When you put the mandlin into the soup, that might be bishul achar afiyah. For those that enjoy dipping cake into a hot coffee, should be wary of the same problem. Because if the cup of coffee, for whatever reason, you weren't machmir, and you poured water straight into the cup, and you made coffee like that, to dunk your donut, I guess you have a hamish of Dunkin' Donuts, you dunk your donut into the hot coffee, if that coffee is a klisheni, it shouldn't be done, because this would be yesh bishul achar afiyah. If you did like most people, that your coffee was prepared in a kli shlishi, then have your Dunkin' Donuts gesund hate, because kli shlishi is incapable of cooking. Someone prepared lakshin, cooked lakshin, to serve with the soup, but they forgot to put the lakshin on the fire, on the blech before Shabbos. Is there any way to serve this lakshin, because you want to have hot soup with hot lakshin, but the lakshin is cold? So here's another example of yagia kapecha kisaychel. Rabbi said the lakshin was cooked. The lakshin is definitely davar yavesh, it's dry. You could put soup into a serving bowl, and add all the lakshin you want. Or you could put soup into your bowl of soup and add lakshin gesundheit. It's a klisheni. So what? Lakshin was cooked. Ein bishul acha bishul. The only issue might be if after you cook the lakshin, Erev Shabbos that is, you rinse the lakshin. So if there's some of that water residue that is still on the lakshin, that water was never cooked. And that water could get cooked, but don't forget, water only could get cooked in a kli rishon. In a kli sheni, it's not an issue. So once you have the hot soup in a kli sheni, you're okay. You could add the lakshin even if there is some water residue. Now what's interesting that the Gemara that we mentioned says water is definitely not kali habishul. There are some poskim that assume it's not only water, it's any liquid. Being that liquid has no density, liquid is the very opposite of a solid, and a solid retains its heat, liquid doesn't. So they assume that the heter of water not being kali habishul is not limited to water, it's any liquid. And therefore, you could add any cold liquid into a kli sheni. If you have a hot cup of water, you could put cold milk in, or cold lemon juice, or cold honey. Any liquid can never get cooked in a kli sheni. However, the Rabbi Yehuda in his drushes writes very strongly against that. And as he says, to add milk that was never cooked into hot water in a kli sheni, he calls it suffix skila. Because maybe only water is definitely not kali habishul. But any other liquid, including milk, should be treated as kali habishul. And that's another reason why the minig is to make coffee with 2 cups. Pour hot water into this cup, and then I pour it into my coffee cup. When I add the milk to that, that's kli shlishi, and there's no problem. I must mention that today's milk, I say today, I don't know what's going to be tomorrow, or maybe even today is not certain, but today's milk used to be pasteurized. Now pasteurization does not need much heat, but usually at 160, it could be pasteurized. So hopefully that's considered bishul. Not so certain, but that might be considered bishul. The problem is today they have a new system that pasteurizes liquids at a much lower temperature, which doesn't qualify to be bishul. So you have to keep your eyes open. If you have milk that was pasteurized, you have another tzad to be mekel. That ain't bishul acha bishul. Okay, it's a davalach, which is not much of a heta, but at least you have something to fall onto when you want to add it to the cup that came straight from the urn. But if indeed there will be a time that milk is pasteurized at a very low temperature, or any other liquid that was not pasteurized, then you have this problem. Try to get it to a kli shlishi and then add any liquid that you want. Again, typically lemon juice and some honeys are also pasteurized, but you have to know the metzias and you have to know to what level, to what temperature they are brought to. The next question is an important question. And that is, today we live in a society, it's the instant society. And how do we apply halacha to the instant society? You know, we want everything instant and nothing should take too much time. Today we already have this prospect of instant soups, believe it or not. Soup was always a big job, instant soups. How does halacha apply to instant foods? So one thing I want to tell you, that here we come to what we began with. And that is, there are certain foods that Chazal said, Hadachoson Zuhi Gemar Malach. That's the Mishnah that we learned earlier. There are some foods that by their very nature are kali habishul, that you need very little to prepare them. Kali habishul means they're easy to prepare. We gave one example, and I think I'd like to use that example as we begin. an egg. An egg doesn't need much to become cooked. You learn the Gemara. You're allowed to cook an egg in the sun. Cham is mutter. Why? I mean, how does it work? The answer is egg cooks easily. So to take a raw egg and cook it on Shabbos is possible without cooking. Take water from the urn, put it into a cup, which is a kli sheni, transfer the hot water into a second cup, kli shlishi, and then put the egg in. It probably will get soft-boiled. But this is what the Chazon Ish was referring to when he said that an egg is a kali habishul. And even in a kli shlishi, perhaps, an egg could get cooked. And this is the sheet of many poskim, that something that's kali habishul, that's really kali habishul, could get cooked even in a kli shlishi. Actually, the Mishnah spoke about pouring hot water from a kli sheni onto a kali habishul. But the poskim assume even kli sheni, pouring from a kli sheni onto something, is similar to a kli shlishi. So basically, putting an egg into a hot water in a kli shlishi, according to many opinions, would be bishul. Now what I found intriguing is the next question. I cooked the eggs before Shabbos, but I didn't cook them fully, and now they're soft-boiled. Can I put these eggs, these fully cooked soft-boiled eggs, however you want to refer to them, and put them into a bowl of hot water, and I'll bring it from soft-boiled to hard-boiled, and then I can make my egg salad. So I saw a beautiful tshuva in the Migdanes Eliyahu in Chele Gimel Siman Lamed Zayin. He was the Rav in Antwerp. He discusses this very concept and other issues of eggs. But basically, I think it should be clear that it's not simple. Because a soft-boiled egg is basically not fully cooked. We call it soft-boiled because we're ready to eat it as it is. But an egg that's cooked is fully cooked. And perhaps it's not yet fully cooked. And by putting it into water, that's the Gemar Malacha of it. And I saw the Shmir Shabbos definitely has a suffix about this. So I can't say it's certainly asa, but I could definitely say it's not pashut at all. Because an egg is kali habishul by its very nature. And an egg that was even partially cooked is still not cooked. It's a soft-boiled egg. And to bring that from soft-boiled to hard-boiled is definitely a chashash of bishul and should be avoided. If you want to have an egg on Shabbos, if you forgot to cook it before Shabbos, follow the Gemara that you learned, which is quoted in Shulchan Aruch and Shin Yud Ches Siv Gimel, and hope it's a sunny Shabbos morning. Crack the egg, put it in the sun, and you'll have a freshly prepared egg on Shabbos, which is mutter lechatchila. Again, an example of a yagia kapecha. The next question is really challenging because it's much more common. You forgot to prepare tea essence before Shabbos. Is there any way to prepare tea sense or tea essence on Shabbos? What you're doing is taking uncooked tea bags, and don't forget, tea bags consist of tea leaves that were never cooked, and you're going to cook it on Shabbos. That seems to be a serious problem. You're cooking uncooked tea leaves on Shabbos. What can be a better bishul than that? And that's true. Lamaisa, putting a tea bag into hot water could be a bishul deraisa. And we could add that tea bags are definitely kali habishul. Because typically, we make tea in a kli sheni. No one puts tea bags into the urn. You take water from the urn, pour it into your teacup, and then you add the tea bag. Now think about it. That means you're making tea in a kli sheni. Now usually things don't get cooked in a kli sheni, but tea is perfectly drinkable the way I just made it. So apparently tea is a kali habishul. And that's why the Aruch HaShulchan asserts that to make tea, even in a kli shlishi, is awesome. And adava yadua she bishulan kal. Says the Aruch HaShulchan, it's well known, it's common knowledge that tea leaves are kali abishul. And he writes very strongly, and if someone does this, he's concerned about a very serious issa of chayiv chatos, the rabbim nichshalim bezeh b'tainoi shel hevel. People do this and rely on foolish arguments to be mekel. Now, the Aruch HaShulchan is not known to be a machmir, but he says it's chayiv chatos, and people do it, and it's foolish. Obviously, he was convinced that a tea bag is kali habishul. The Mishnah Berurah discusses how to make a tea on Shabbos if you forgot to warm the tea sense, and he discusses that at length, but he doesn't suggest take a tea bag and make it in a kli shlishi. I think it's clear that the Mishnah Berurah did not permit making tea in a kli shlishi. However, Paisik Dairein Rav Moshe finds his Zechaynu Levracha in a tshuva felt that kli shlishi is totally incapable of cooking. The chumrah that we saw regarding kali abishul is irui kli sheni, but kli shlishi is incapable of cooking. Rav Moshe adds, the Aruch HaShulchan proves that you could cook in a kli shlishi, because look, tea, you're making a kli shlishi, it's fine, it tastes good. Rav Moshe says, but that's not a proof, because if you take tea bag and put it in cold water, it also has a tea flavor. So obviously, you can't prove it from a kli shlishi, because even cold water does the trick. Now, those that held like the Aruch HaShulchan responded to this point that it's not true, because tea that's made in cold water has a different taste to it. Tea that's prepared in a hot water, albeit kli shlishi, has a tea flavor. So there is a way of preparing tea in a kli shlishi that makes it a real hot tea, unlike cold water that has a iced tea flavor. So I will not be machriya, but I could say that Aruch HaShulchan does write emphatically that that's some of these chayshish v'chatas. Rav Moshe held once it got to a kli shlishi, it is totally incapable of cooking. Now, another tricky question, but here you see how every bit of information has to be used, and we will find it very enlightening how every nuance of our Torah is so important. And now the question is preparing a hot soup from a cup of instant hot soup. Now basically, it's a foam cup that has lakshin, dried lakshin, noodles, with dehydrated vegetable cubes, spices, and you add water and you let it sit for a while, and then you have a nice hot bowl of soup that simulates a regular hot bowl of soup. It has the lakshin, the vegetables, and the spices. The question is, can you make that on Shabbos? So like every other shayla, you have to know the facts, because if you're groping in darkness, you won't get to the emes. The facts of these instant soups, that they are comprised of basically three different parts. The lakshin, the noodles, some of them were lakshin that were dried. Typically lakshin is dried, but the lakshin themselves were never cooked. You can't cook lakshin and put in the soup, that won't work. So it's lakshin that was never cooked, but it's dried in a way that with minimal heat from water, hot water, that's able to cook the lakshin. So the lakshin begins as raw lakshin, but when it sits in water, the hot water that you add it to the cup, it will cook. There are some lakshin that are deep fried, and presumably if it is deep fried halacha, deep fried is like bishul. Deep fried, so you're cooking the lakshin in the water, in the oil. So that would be another example of lakshin, that it's made crisp, but it was deep fried. The vegetables typically are cubes that are dehydrated, never cooked. And spices are like other spices, ground pepper we learned earlier. and there is some flavoring that could be cooked before. It's the extract of a soup, so the flavoring, some of it's cooked and some is not. Now the question is, is there any way to prepare a hot soup from the instant soup that I bought and I want to enjoy on Shabbos? So you realize that this is fraught with some major problems. Primarily the lakshin. If the lakshin in your soup cup was from that brand that was never cooked, it was dried, so then by adding water you're cooking it. And the truth is, it's much more serious, because the whole chachma of instant soup is they make it that it cooks easy. I'll use a halachic term. They make kalei bishul and they market it because the appeal is what we really want. We want to be able to cook soup on the spur of the moment and enjoy it as a hot soup. So what they did is they took the chachma of kalei bishul and they made a soup out of it. They made lakshin and vegetables and spices that are mixed with hot water in a kli sheni and could cook. But again, here we say the way it's made is always in a kli sheni. People don't take this soup mix and dump it into the pot on the fire. They always make it in a kli sheni. So once we realize that this soup mix, the lakshin, the vegetables, and the spices are kalei bishul, and that's exactly the problem that we're concerned with. And that's why, according to the Aruch HaShulchan's understanding, that kalei bishul is also even a kli shlishi, it is definitely true that preparing a soup mix in this kli shlishi, you pour water from the urn into a cup, and from there onto the instant soup cup is a problem. Because actually it's not kli shlishi yet, it's iri kli sheni, which is definitely a problem. Rav Moshe, that held that nothing cooks in a kli shlishi, would probably permit making the soup if you make it a kli shlishi. Now again, you can't use iri kli sheni, in other words, you can't pour water from the urn into a cup and pour that directly onto the instant soup, because that's iri kli sheni, and that's a problem. But if you use one cup and then another cup, and that kli shlishi you pour it onto the soup, according to Rav Moshe would be muta, according to the Aruch HaShulchan and those that side with the Aruch HaShulchan, if indeed the water is still hot enough to cook it, and that's its method of preparation, which typically is by a soup mix, that would still classify as a kalei bishul. Instant oatmeal, there are two types, but the real that's really instant is the oats that are toasted and were not cooked. By adding water, you could make oatmeal on Shabbos. It's basically the same idea. They prepared it in a way that it is a kalei bishul form, and by adding water, it prepares the oatmeal, and that should be the same, like we said regarding the instant soup, that's using a kalei bishul on Shabbos, which of course should be also. And the last question, which is good news, I guess, people that have children or grandchildren, they might wonder, so how could I make baby cereal on Shabbos? Why is that any different than instant oatmeal? The answer is there's a fundamental difference. Because the instant oatmeal, as I said, was never cooked. The oats were toasted and prepared, but never cooked. The baby cereal typically are cooked. They're cooked and then dried, so by adding water, you sort of enhance the cooked cereal. But there's nothing in the baby cereal, at least at this point, that was not cooked. And basically, it should be mutter to do it in any way. And this is something that is not like coffee and tea that liquefies and it's a soluble. This becomes a salad or a semi-salad. So preparing the baby cereal on Shabbos would be mutter, and especially in the case where you need it for the child. So certainly that would be another example of a yagia kepecha kisoichel. Thank you very much for listening, and mazel tov, and we should continue enjoying mazel tov, mazel tov, mazel tov.